Hello and welcome to Terror Below, a game heavily inspired by the film Tremors, which actually involves you going round, moving rubble, collecting eggs and trying to deliver them to places in order to score the highest amount of points possible. It's a game which basically ends when a player either scores 20 victory points or when one player dies. So, to steal a quote from Tremors itself, let's go and have a look how everything works and stuff. So in Terror Below, your aim is either to get as many victory points as possible or to try to survive the longest. So you're going to want to try and increase your chances of staying alive that long. So you're going to be armed with accessory cards and weapon cards. More about those a bit later. So at the beginning of the game, you're going to have a squad of 3 different characters. At the beginning of the game, you have to arrange as to which one you want to currently play as. There's no health to these characters. It's simply a case of when they get hit or something bad happens to them, they just die. So, how exactly do you take a turn in the game? Well, that all depends on your vehicle cards. Vehicle cards are going to have a number of things on them. They're going to have a distraction, they're going to have an ability, and they're going to have a number in the top left-hand corner. So what do these all mean? Well, first of all, the number in the top left-hand corner is going to denote how many actions you get to take on your turn. More on that in a bit. What you're going to do is you're going to take one of these cards and you're going to place it on the board underneath one of the worms. Then what's going to happen is it's going to trigger your distraction, which are basically a series of arrows at the bottom of the card. Not all cards have them, some of them don't distract the worms at all. The worms on the board are indicated by these little tokens. These standees that you actually get in the game are probably too big and cumbersome in order to actually place on the spaces on the board. So instead you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit. There's no miniatures here apart from your really cool little cars which represent you on the board. So what's going to happen then is that worm is going to move. This is really important because a big part of the game, if you want to survive, is trying to keep the worms away from you and keep them on your opponents. So you're going to be trying to move that worm in the direction of other people. You have to think really carefully about where you're actually going to place your distraction card though, because although you may want to move one worm, you may not necessarily want it to attack people. Attacking is defined by how many cards are currently placed underneath each card. So every worm card that you find is going to have a number of health and a number that's in this kind of little explosive symbol here. That represents how many cards can be placed underneath them before it triggers an attack. And when an attack happens, you're going to have to defend yourself. That's where your weapon and accessory cards come into play. Accessories have a number of different abilities, most notably hats, which tend to give you extra kind of abilities throughout the game. Some of them are one-time uses. Your weapons, however, are going to be triggered whenever a worm attacks. So what's going to happen is, depending on how many people the worm is going to attack, as denoted on the worm card itself, all the players are going to take in turns, starting with the first player, or the first player in turn order that is being attacked by the worm, because the worm can attack multiple people at once. That person does as many hits as they possibly can, then it moves on to the next person who tries to hit as many times as possible on them. Should you manage to reach that target health indicator on the worm card and actually kill the worm, the person who got the killing blow is the person who gets the points for it. You get a victory point for it, but you also have these bounties at the top of the board, which are basically done by either killing certain worms or delivering certain goods. More on that later. So what do you do after you've distracted the worm and moved it? Then you trigger your actions. You're going to have a number, like I said, as indicated in the top left-hand corner, and you're going to do one of a number of different things. You can either move your piece from one space of the board to the next. You can do this multiple times, as well as moving rubble. You can't move into a space that contains rubble. So, if you want, you can pick up a piece of rubble for a turn. Should you ever get 3 pieces of rubble on your character, you get to choose between either taking an accessory card or a weapons card. So this kind of helps you build up your arsenal to be able to deal with things later on. Another thing you can do on your turn is you can ramp another car. This actually allows you to move diagonally, because usually you wouldn't be allowed to. You can usually just move orthogonically. So for one turn, you move from your space, kind of on top of the car, a car that's next to you, and then you can move into any available space from there. So like I said, it can in some ways get you to move diagonally instead. Only takes one turn and technically moves you 2 spaces rather than 1. So the next thing that you can do is you can collect an egg. However, this is going to trigger the end of your turn if you do it. So a lot of the time it's going to take very careful planning. You're going to want to do everything else you want to do and try to finish on picking up an egg. However, you do pick up every egg in that space. So if there's more of them, you're getting loads of them for it. The last thing you can do with your actions is you can, if you're lucky enough to be in a location tile, you can deliver an egg. At this point, you get a number of things happen. You can either take 1 victory point and just deliver the egg, or if there's currently a bounty that currently matches the location you're in and the coloured egg that you're trying to deliver matches as well, then you get extra bonus points. You get to take that bounty instead. So that gets you extra points. Also, you get a bonus depending on which location you've delivered at. These range from reviving one of your characters to gaining extra weapon cards, extra action cards, extra bonus points for the end of the game. So really, you want to plan out carefully how you're going to route your way around the map, all whilst avoiding everyone else's distractions. So it's a very mean-spirited game. You're going to be constantly trying to foil your opponent. After all that's done, you've got one last action at the end of your turn, which usually has a description on it such as move the nearest target worm into your space. It tends to be balanced out depending on what action card you've played as your vehicle card towards the beginning of the game. So what will happen is you will either have a low number of actions with a really good action on it on the bottom of the card, or you will probably have a high number which will have something ridiculous on it, like I said, like move all worms closer to your car. It's a really interesting system and means you have to think very carefully about how you're going to play these cards. Once all of these actions have been done, you then get to trigger any possible worm attack. So you check every single worm to see how many cards are underneath them, and then trigger an attack if any of them meet their card limit. After that, play moves round to the next player, and then the next player, and it pretty much carries on like that until the end of the game. There's really not a great deal to it, and although a lot of it sounds very complicated to begin with, because there's a lot of rules to this game, they're all very simple and move the game along very nicely. So really, there's not a lot more to talk about in this game really. It's very straightforward. I've pretty much explained everything you'd need to know to actually play this game. The most complicated things in this game tends to be the things in setup. For example, when a worm disappears, you have to replace the worm, you have to set it up in a location, and like I said, you have to be very careful about these attack lines here. So it tells you what coloured egg to drop and where to place rubble. If anyone's ever caught in a space with an egg or the rubble, they get attacked. It's really as simple as that. That's probably the most complicated rule actually in this game. Everything else follows a very straightforward rule set. Like I said, the only thing you're going to probably be looking up is what bonus effects you actually get from each different location. There is one last thing I really wanted to talk about, and that's the solo variant of this game. I've never really been a fan of games that provide a solo experience. I'm not talking about games which are designed as a solo experience, but more multiplayer games that are often boiled down into a solo experience. So for example, in this game, you actually have a number of missions that you can play as a solo game compared to other games which tend to put an AI in it that move around in a certain way and try to mimic another player. Those I don't like so much because a lot of the fun and joy of board games is often actually playing with people and actually working through it together. So the only alternative I can really find for people that enjoy these kind of experiences when it comes to board games is to have a mission-based system like this. So for example, you are on a time limit. Every single worm that appears, and they explain this away by saying when the worms cause too much chaos, the game is over. Once you place your 15th worm and the 15th worm attack has been made, the game ends. And if you haven't completed your objectives, it's done by that point. It's actually very, very difficult, like I found almost any solo game usually is. It is, however, a lot more fun than a lot of other ones that I've played. I don't like playing against someone that just gets bonus after bonus after bonus. I like to know what my goal is and how much time I have to do it in. And sure, things can still work against you. There is still an element of randomness to it, but it never feels like you're being unfairly treated. So the AIs I usually find in games, and the one which I'll really draw up here is the one in Villages, where I was talking about it and I was saying that in the solo game you were being kind of outdone all the time. The AI player always had extra tricks up their sleeve that you could not pull on them. So they constantly had a foot forward all the time. The actual game played exactly the same, and it was playing out like you were playing against an opponent that was also playing, and they kind of figured a system to try to simulate that. And it just never works as well in games, I find. I much prefer having something like this where they actually change the nature of the game altogether. So you're not playing against other opponents, you're actually playing against time or something along the lines of that, or you have missions that you have to complete. I much prefer that, and I actually really have to give this game props for that. I'm going to say this game is not for everyone, therefore I don't think we can wholly recommend this game. I very much enjoy this game, but if you're going to play it with people, you have to play it with people that are expecting people to be mean to them. This is a game basically made to be able to screw over everyone else. You are forever trying to push the worms in other players' directions. You are playing items from your hand that are going to ruin their plans for the game. So it's very, very snappy, and there's a certain type of person that's not going to enjoy this, such as when a table is ganging up on a single person. It's going to happen in this game, and so anyone who doesn't enjoy that is not really going to enjoy this. I also think some people are going to be bothered by the fact that you've got standees that play absolutely no part in the game whatsoever, and in fact all your enemies are represented by these little target indicators instead. It is probably going to bother some people, but personally I don't have a problem with that. To be honest, it's a really frantic, chaotic game that provided me with a lot of fun, and a lot of my friends as well, because we all kind of like the trolly nature of board gaming. You definitely have to enjoy that in order to enjoy this game. We played one game, our first game of this, everyone played very, very passively, and it just did not really click. It felt very boring, and it kind of needed someone to start being a bit mean. Basically no one was ever getting attacked by any worms because everyone was moving worms into locations where no one else was, which can be of benefit at times in the game. One of the missions that you get, one of the extra bounties that you get, is hunting worms. So sometimes you don't want to send a certain worm towards someone when you know they can probably beat it and pick up a whole bunch of extra victory points from doing so. So there are times when you want to move worms away from one another, but the table is all working against one another in order to push the worms that people can't beat towards everyone else, and keeping the ones which they think people will be able to defeat away from them. So it's a really interesting mechanic in that way. Other than that, I don't think there's much else to really talk about here. It's a very, very straightforward game, and like I said, I think it's 50-50 as to whether you're going to enjoy this or not. It really depends on what type of gamer you are. I think it's simple enough that you can introduce new people to it, but at the same time I don't think this is a game you really want to throw at a new gamer particularly, and we take that stance a lot here. We talk a lot about how you would play these games with new people to the hobby, and this certainly is one that would not meet that mark. However, I do very much enjoy it. I love the theme. I love the simple nature of the game. The game moves along very, very quickly. You do get a little bit of analysis paralysis in the game, but it doesn't tend to hamper too much in it. Apart from that, thank you for joining us. This was voted on by our patrons. You can become a patron yourself by going to patreon.com/everybodydice, and you can donate from as little as $1 a month, and you can vote towards our next game for the next month as to what we review. We tend to put a list of recent releases and things like that on there, so you get to choose between them and say which games you actually want us to be reviewing. It really helps us. So apart from that, if you want to follow us on social medias, you can do at Everybody Dice Show for Instagram and at Everybody Dice for Twitter. You can find all of our things in one place at everybodydice.com. And that's really it. Thank you very much for joining us. We will see you with another one of these next month. Bye!